Let's move on to today's second program. I want to introduce our two co-presenters, Jaclyn Schildkraut and Emily Greene-Colozzi. Jaclyn is the Executive Director of the Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. That's a mouthful. Prior to this appointment, she served as an Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at the State University of New York at Oswego. Her research focuses on school and mass shootings in the United States in regard to crime statistics, media representations, security and prevention, legislative responses, and other important considerations that impact individuals and communities struck by these tragedies. You may recall Jaclyn presented here a couple of years ago on the tragic Uvalde shooting, and she was scheduled to appear in 2023 along with Amanda Nickerson to present their co-authored book, Lockdown Drills, which was presented at Buff State, our one and only time that we haven't been in this facility. Emily Greene-Colozzi is an assistant professor in the School of Criminology and Justice Studies at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. She's a team member of the expansive Sharing Information to Stop Mass Shootings project, which they're going to discuss today, and I won't say anything more about it. Jaclyn and Emily are co-authors of Understanding Mass Shootings, which will be released this coming June. You can buy it on Amazon. You can pre-buy it now. So without further ado, Jaclyn and Emily, please come on out.
Thank you all so much for having us today. I'm Jackie, and
I'm Emily.
And we actually did have a third co-presenter, but he's very allergic to cold weather, so he's still in Texas. But Hunter is here in spirit, so just pretend he's here and slightly as funny as we are. So we're going to be talking to you guys today about understanding the threat landscape preceding mass public shootings. And a couple years ago, when I was here, there was a great presentation by the National Threat Assessment Center. How many of you guys have read the reports that they've put out on completed and averted shootings? Good few of you. So those reports are really helpful, and what we kind of feel is that they've set a great foundation for the work that we've been able to do, and so we're now looking to build upon that a little more and also translate it into useful, I guess, programmatic training, if you will, for the public. So a couple of goals today just to kind of set the mood of what you can expect from us besides awesome presentation skills. Is first we're going to just give you an overview of this project. This is something that we are very, very passionate about. We've been working on for a while, and we're actually pretty excited because you guys are the first people who will hear our findings. We literally finished analyzing our data 10 days ago, I think. So feedback is welcomed, questions are welcomed. Please hold your rude remarks. We'll also go through the project findings, so what we found through all of the different work that we did, and we're going to tie that all together with a case study showing how what we've been able to document through our project findings can actually translate into meaningful prevention. Now, before we begin, I do have to give a disclaimer. This project was funded in part by the United States Department of Homeland Security through their Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention Program. And so all ideas, whether good or bad, are not theirs, they are ours. So everything falls to us, and these are not this does not represent DHS or any of its employees. So I'll start off by giving you guys an overview of the project. And so we would like to introduce you to SISMs, which is Sharing Information to Stop Mass Shootings. And as you might guess, coming up with an acronym is just as hard as it sounds, but this was a sort of brainchild on the way to the dentist, so we ran with it. So the goal of our project was really to think about how can we use what we've learned through all of the research that's been done on mass public shootings to help prevent more of these tragedies. Because one of the things that our research has shown, that NTAC's research has shown, is that the number one reason why these tragedies don't happen is because someone with information comes forward, and then somebody who receives the information actually does something. And so we wanted to think about how we could leverage what we know to get more people to come forward. So we wanted to think about how do we improve awareness? How do we get people to understand that what they are observing is in fact something that is concerning and not just everyday sort of throwaway comments. Like when you say, I'm going to shoot up my school, that's not, oh, that's just Timmy blowing off steam again. Like that's important. Like we should actually do something about that. We also wanted to think about how we could improve reporting, because a lot of people are aware of information, but for a variety of reasons, they don't come forward and say anything. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a cough today, so I apologize. A lot of it comes down to the bystander effect, thinking, well, if I've seen it, someone else must have seen it, so they're gonna report it, and I don't need to. And it's sort of, then everybody ends up not saying something. And so ultimately, our goal is to prevent more of these tragedies, because realistically, in the context of firearm violence, these are one of the most preventable forms of gun violence and tragedies that our nation experiences on all too regular of a frequency. So a starting point for us was to build new databases for this project. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, there's already databases on mass public shootings available out there. Why on earth did you invest time in building new databases? Great question, thank you for that. And so if you look at the databases that are currently out there, they're predicated primarily on media records, usually single story as a source. You don't have to triangulate or anything like that. And so we know that there's a lot of methodological issues with the media, despite how readily available it is, right? It's everywhere, it's free, we can access it, that's great. But one of the challenges, for instance, is that what they usually will tell you at the beginning right after a shooting is not really what's going on, and then they don't correct it later, or somebody's capturing an early story and not a later story. And so we decided that we wanted to kind of, I guess for lack of a better word, reinvent the hamster wheel. And so we said, look, we recognize that we still need to use media records, but we don't want to prioritize it in the same way. So we came up with a 3-tiered coding system that starts at the top with official records. And so these are things like law enforcement investigative reports, court documents, and even materials that have been generated directly by the perpetrators. These are what we consider our gold standard. And just in case anybody is wondering why I have random colors on this slide, if you ever download our database, once it becomes available, we've actually coded the data in these colors, so you know exactly what tiered source the data come from. So if you see yellow, you're like, all right, that's gold standard tier 1 data. If it's blue, it's media, so that's tier 3. And let me bring you to tier 2, which is our summary and interpretive records. And so these are things like law enforcement press releases, or from district attorneys' press releases, after action reports, case studies. So they're still official, but not necessarily as official or to the same level of scrutiny that investigative records would be. And so then we also still used, as I mentioned, the media records, but for the purposes of our study, it has to be triangulated across at least 3 reputable sources. So no offense, but like you can't use the New York Post or the Daily Mail. Like you have to use credible news sources, and you have to find the same information in 3 sources. And as we told our RAs, it cannot be the same article by the Associated Press in 3 different newspapers. So our starting point then, once we've developed our scheme, is we now actually have to collect the data that we want to use to build said database. And so we started off by submitting public records requests. And for this phase of the project, which is all phase 1, we submitted 280 individual records requests to police agencies and court offices around the country. So after this presentation, if anybody ever wants to know how to submit a public records request, please feel free to reach out, and I'd be more than happy to talk you through it. In total, we collected over 148,000 pages of records. And this really runs the gamut depending on the case. We have some states where they can give you just blanketed denials and they're like, no, our state says we don't have to do it, so we don't do it. And sometimes we argue and appeal with them, and then other times we're just like, not worth it. Like, we have learned Pennsylvania will not give you anything. California is very hit or miss. But we also, the amount of stuff you get per case is very different. So we had like some cases, like one in Houston where we got 5 pages, and then you look at Columbine and we had almost 24,000 pages on Columbine. So it really ran the gamut. We also conducted open source searches. So this is using, what is it, like 20 different databases and search engines to then try to supplement what we have through these official records. And from there, we had 3 wonderful research assistants who we would give our endless gratitude to so that we didn't have to read all of this. They went and coded this with a very extensive coding document. So our coding document was 37 pages, and it runs the gamut. Emily will talk a little bit more about what was included in that in terms of the categories and variables we were looking for. But they went through and coded all of the cases. And then, because one of the things that's really important in research is validity and reliability, we then went back, myself, Emily, and Hunter went back and verified the cases. So one of us would review it, put together a memo of, okay, like, here's the things that we don't think are right, or the coding's a little bit off here, and then one of the other ones of us would then weigh in, and we would then make the appropriate changes and finalize the coding, then assemble a database from all of the finalized case studies. So this went on until about
10 days ago.
2 months ago. And so then we were able to assemble the database, and then, as I mentioned, about 2 weeks ago, finally, we got to play around and analyze the data, which, if you're data nerds like us, and she's more of a data nerd than I am, that's like the fun stuff that you're like hoping to get to. So we're gonna kind of transition into the project findings now. I'm gonna go over the event findings and then turn it over to Emily to talk more about the perpetrator findings. But in our study, we had 171 cases. And this is the map that depicts where they are all located based on the magnitude of the number of casualties for the events. And so we looked from 1999 through the end of 2024. We picked 1999 because, number one, you had Columbine, which even though mass shootings had been going on for years before Columbine, that's really sort of that cultural watershed moment that everybody remembers. And the other reason is because that's also around when the internet was invented. And if you've ever done a public records request on something that old, you will know like how hard it is to even get people to give you anything, because they're like, well, we have to go to the archives, and then we have to scan it and digitize it. It becomes this whole thing where they just gripe at you a lot. So we just kind of limited it to 1999. And the reason we went to 2024 is because the funding cycle for our project with DHS originally was October 2024 to the end of September 2026. And if we didn't have an endpoint, we would have just kept going forever. And I should mention, the reason it's 171 cases, there's actually obviously more cases that did occur in that time point, but we were really focused on those perpetrators who had outwardly expressed concerning behaviors or communications. And fortunately, Emily had collected some of that information in her dissertation data, so we were able to narrow down the cases and just focus on those. So that's what we're really presenting on today. We are currently in phase 2 of the project, where we're collecting records on all of the other cases, coding those, and then building hopefully a much better comprehensive mousetrap that will be out later this year or early next year. So in terms of the different location types where these incidents occurred, school and workplaces were the most common, which makes a lot of sense because these individuals often choose those location types that they are the most comfortable and familiar with. These are places that they've frequented, they know the patterns of security, they know the patterns of, the ebb and flow of how people travel and when throughout the building during the day. And so there's an element of comfort, but there's also that element of familiarity and understanding, in advance, like what things you might be challenged by. But you can also see here that there's a range of other locations, from shopping and entertainment venues to military, even transportation. We had obviously the New York City subway shooting, and then we had another shooting that was literally on a bus while it was moving. In terms of the casualty information in those 171 cases, there were 734 individuals who were killed and another 1,257 who were injured. Of course, as we always want to acknowledge within the context of our research, these are the number of people who sustained physical injuries. This number significantly underestimates the number of people who were impacted by these tragedies. In terms of the resolutions, lethal police interdiction was the most common, unless you actually collapse the suicide categories, then suicide was more common. But we should note that with lethal police interdiction, it means that police used lethal force, not necessarily that they actually killed the perpetrator. And you can see here that there's also non-lethal police interdiction, both types of civilian interdiction, as well as fleeing and surrendering. And just about 55% of the perpetrators in this particular sample were deceased by the end of the attack. So in terms of the perpetrator findings, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Emily.
Thank you. Jackie is an excellent public speaker. I am not, so I have notes. And she's also going to take over this clicker if it proves to be too much multitasking for me. But I'm going to start by talking about the perpetrators who are in our data set. So as Jackie said, across the 171 incidents, we had 175 perpetrators. So there are a few cases, I believe 4, that had more than one perpetrator. So they had dyads working, 2 people. And consistent with a lot of research that's already out there, we saw that the average age of perpetrators was around 33 years old. And the overwhelming majority of them were male. In terms of race and ethnicity, about 62% of the perpetrators were white, 18% were black, and then we see smaller proportions for other races and ethnicities. And looking at some of the background characteristics of these individuals, about 1/3 of them were unemployed at the time of the shooting, and about 1/5 of them were students at the time of the attack. And some other interesting things that we see in their backgrounds, nearly 30% of them had a documented criminal history, and about 64% of them had prior contact with law enforcement, which may or may not have included criminal or illegal behavior, but just some kind of interaction with law enforcement. Another interesting thing that again is documented in research is that around 24% of our perpetrators had some kind of domestic violence history. Not necessarily conviction. You'll see at the bottom of this chart, only about 1% had actual convictions, but this was just a history of domestic or family violence. And also important is that some of these perpetrators had disqualifying factors under federal firearms laws. So these are things like felony convictions or, like I said, domestic violence convictions that would have prohibited them from gun ownership. But it was really a small proportion that was legally prohibited from possessing firearms, meaning that many of them did acquire their firearms legally. And I want to go a little bit into our research framework before we go forward. I'm sure this is going to be familiar to a lot of folks in this room. But to better understand how these attacks develop over time, we use the path to intended violence model, which was developed, I think in the 90s by Calhoun and Weston to look at various forms of targeted violence, including terrorism and assassinations, and it's since been applied to the mass violence context quite extensively. But this model describes a series of behavioral stages that individuals move through as they progress towards violence. So I'm going to go through each of these stages, and it will help better contextualize the findings. So we start with grievance. So grievances can be real or perceived. The important thing is that they create strain and stress for the individual who's experiencing the grievance. So examples of grievances could be interpersonal conflicts, job loss, relationship troubles or loss, feelings of general injustice, bullying and harassment. And these grievances serve as the starting point of the escalation process on the path to intended violence. And following grievance, in response to these strains, some individuals may begin engaging in violent ideation. So what happens is they start to imagine violence as a legitimate way to resolve their grievances, to fix their problems. So this can involve fantasies of revenge or retaliation, and this is very much a psychological process at this point, but it's an important shift where the violence becomes mentally normalized as a possible solution to problems and strains and stressors. And at some point, the individual then might make the decision to act on these fantasies. And again, this is the point where ideation transitions into action. And once that decision is made, the behaviors oftentimes begin to manifest outwardly, so in a very observable fashion. And what's important about this is it creates potential opportunities for other individuals surrounding the would-be perpetrator to observe warning signs. So once the decision is made, an individual may begin planning the attack. And this can involve things like gathering information about potential targets, like building layouts or schedules, patterns of general movement. Perpetrators also frequently study previous mass shooters, so they examine what they perceive as successful tactics and learn how other mass shooters may have carried out their attacks, what kinds of weapons they used. And they also begin other logistical preparations, so acquiring weapons, gathering ammunition, and practicing with their firearms. Many perpetrators will indeed practice at formal or informal gun ranges to become familiar with their weapons. Some may use simulations, so first-person shooter video games, for example. And in some cases, perpetrators begin to probe boundaries at the actual location they want to target. So what this looks like could be testing how much suspicious behavior they can engage in without being detected. And we also see leakage of violent intent at this point. And this is one of the most important warning signs that can be observed on the path to intended violence. So leakage refers to the communication of violent intent to a third party. And it can occur through verbal statements, which includes text messages, online posts, written communication, essays, or it could even be in the form of artwork. And because leakage is occurring prior to the attack, it's one of the most overt opportunities for intervention and prevention if people are paying attention and they're understanding and interpreting what they're seeing. And as perpetrators move closer to the attack, they may also engage in final acts. So these are behaviors that may detach them from social relationships. So they might give away their possessions. They may prepare legacy materials like suicide notes or manifestos, journals, and letters. They may also make verbal farewells to people in their lives. And if the individual is not interrupted at some point along this pathway, the final stage is carrying out the attack. And what the pathway framework illustrates for us is this escalation of behaviors leading up to the moment of attack. As individuals move closer to the attack, their behaviors tend to become more serious, as well as more intentional, and therefore more observable. And it's important to emphasize also that behaviors are not perfectly linear on this pathway. So the pathway doesn't progress in an ordered, kind of normal pathway for everybody. People may move back and forth between various stages. They may spend longer time in certain stages as well. And what we see, and I think what our data will illustrate, is this conversion of multiple risk factors that all occur at the same time. So essentially a perfect storm. And by understanding these various risk factors and how they're converging together, we can see opportunities to de-escalate individuals along the pathway and help to remove them from the pathway. And this, in the long run, will help allow us to prevent attacks from occurring. All right, so now onto our empirical findings. So we looked at perpetrator grievances. So like I said, we looked at these sort of categories of the pathway to violence. We identified 118 various grievances, 118, that's a lot, 18 grievances and stressors that were experienced by perpetrators in our data set prior to the attack occurring. Some of the more common ones were psychiatric concerns, job loss or employment troubles, as well as things like relationship loss, family troubles, and school-related problems. On average, perpetrators had about 4.8 grievances happening simultaneously. So this highlights kind of what we expected, which is that there's a cumulative nature of strain happening in many of these cases. And sort of as an example of this, we can look at the relationship between our 5 most prevalent stressors in grievances. So psychiatric or mental health concerns are among the most prevalent stressors identified, which you saw on the table on the previous page. We had 113 perpetrators who had some kind of psychiatric concern. And I'm sorry, if we look at the proportion of individuals who had mental illness who are also experiencing one of the other 4 factors, we can see that the prevalence ranges from 41% to just about 61, or just over 61%. Yeah.
So one thing to think, am I on? One thing to think about with regard to that is, any one of those 5 things on its own can be very catastrophic and challenging for an individual to cope with, but then you put them all together and it's sort of that snowballing effect where it makes it really difficult to try and manage. You're like juggling all these balls and they just keep splattering and you can't kind of stop the train now that it's left the station. So it makes it really hard to cope in what we would consider a more pro-social way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's kind of what this diagram is showing. If we look at how many of the perpetrators in our sample had any 2 of these factors present, we can see that it ranges from 14% to about 27%, which is a pretty, significant proportion. And this also doesn't account for the other 13 grievances and stressors. Like I said, there was 18 that we identified as being present in a proportion of our sample. So if we were to include those, this would be a much larger web. Okay, moving on, continuing on this path to violence, we looked at research and planning behaviors. And one of the most common planning behaviors was researching potential target locations, as well as studying previous mass shooters, researching weapons, and surveilling locations in person. So these perpetrators often went to the site that they had intended to target, and they actually physically kind of looked around and did planning behaviors. On average, perpetrators engaged in almost 3 different research behaviors leading up to the attack. And these included things like weapons acquisition and preparation. So perpetrators brought an average of 1.7, we could round up to 2 firearms to the attack. More than 40% of them also had access to additional firearms in their home. Most of these firearms were purchased directly from federally licensed firearms dealers. Like we mentioned before, not many of our perpetrators had disqualifying factors that would have prohibited that. Some, though, were obtained through private sales, theft, straw purchases, and we saw things, obtainment related to accessing the gun in the home or theft were most commonly associated with juvenile perpetrators. And perpetrators also accumulated significant amounts of ammunition leading up to the attack, and even bringing the ammunition to the attack. So on average, perpetrators brought about 188 rounds to the scene. And these are conservative estimates of how many rounds were present. Very often in the reports that we would read, the documents would reference bags or boxes of ammunition that were found on the perpetrator, kind of loose ammunition lying around. So when we didn't have the exact amount, we would just have to kind of estimate what we were looking at. So again, this is probably an undercount. In addition, perpetrators had additional weapons sometimes, as well as costuming. So knives or explosives were sometimes brought to the scene. And when knives were part of the attack, it was less common that they were actually used in the course of the attack, whereas if a perpetrator brought explosives, we saw more frequently that they actually used them. So we coded for whether these additional weapons were present and whether they were used. And perpetrators also had various costuming elements that they brought with them as part of the attack. So various forms of tactical gear like ballistic vests, helmets, face coverings, gas masks. Some of them dressed up as well as fictional or real-life individuals who had committed violence in the past. Probably not surprising, one of the more common real-life, I don't want to say characters, but individuals that they would mimic were the 1999 Columbine shooting perpetrators. And we also looked at legacy tokens. So perpetrators sometimes anticipate dying in the attack, so they may create legacy tokens to be found after their death. It may explain their motivations or apologize sometimes. And one of the most common forms of legacy tokens that we saw was a manifesto. But you can see that there's various forms, including suicide notes. We had less than 6.6% of audio manifestos. Somebody wrote messages on a bullet. Someone left a photo album for the FBI. So various forms of legacy tokens. And on average, perpetrators spend more than 300 days planning their attacks. So this is almost 10 months of planning. And of course, there was a range of planning. This is just the average. And in some cases, planning happened over the course of several years. So this was an idea, this was, path to violence that was very, very long lasting. But the important thing about that is that it suggests there were probably multiple opportunities for detection and intervention over that course of time. All right, so moving on to some of the leakage that we observed. We looked at leakage channels, so we were interested in the mode of communication that perpetrators use to leak their violent intent. And one of the most common forms of leakage was literally verbal communication or text messaging. So we combine those together sort of in the umbrella of verbal communication. But basically, perpetrators just literally told someone what they were planning to do, either in person or through a text. But we also see online communication. There was a small amount of perpetrators who use art to communicate their violent intent. And social media was also a type of communication mode we looked at as a secondary channel. And we saw threats appear on various platforms, more commonly Facebook or sort of other random online platforms where people could get together and talk. And we wanted to look at who was observing this leakage. So again, we could get a better idea of what individuals are well positioned to observe and intervene along the pathway to violence. So we looked at different leakage observers, and some of the categories that we saw more commonly observing concerning behaviors were in-person friends, parents, guardians, and coworkers. Again, a lot of this sort of follows common sense. The people who are closest to the perpetrators are the ones who are more likely to see these warning signs. On average, there are about 2.6 categories of individuals who observed leakage. Again, including categories like family members, classmates, community members, coworkers. And I just want to note, and Jackie can jump in here if I don't do a good job explaining, this number doesn't represent the total number of individual people who observed. This is just the number of categories we saw. So we didn't actually count the number of people within each category who were observing these warning signs and leakage, just sort of get a sense of the different roles, the different categories of people who might notice these behaviors. If we did want to do that, if we wanted to look at how many specific observers were involved in, somebody along this path to intended violence, we could do something like a social network. So that's what's depicted here. This is the social network that we conducted for a paper that we just put out, looking at the observers surrounding the perpetrator of the 2018 shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. We identified 77 individuals that we were able to identify in the social network. 76 of them observed some kind of warning sign, some kind of leakage prior to the event. And many of these people observed multiple different concerning behaviors or warning signs. And what this shows us is not only the density and the amount of people who could potentially surround these perpetrators, who could be observing and reporting and intervening on this path to intended violence, but also the interconnectedness of these individuals. So these, each of these lines between the nodes and the points on this graph show people who were connected and who were communicating and talking to each other. So sort of lines of communication between different individuals. We also wanted to look at the manner in which various threats were communicated. So we looked at different types of threats, and kind of consistent with what we saw in terms of mode of communication. Often perpetrators were very direct in what they were communicating. So directly saying, I'm going to shoot up the office, I'm going to shoot up the school, was far more common than veiled or conditional threats, like if you fire me, then I'm going to do something bad. Very often the perpetrators were extremely direct about their intentions. And given the large number of category of observers that we identified, which again is an undercount of the actual number of observers, we wanted to understand how much reporting was going on. So we got a sense of who was observing these various warning signs, but where did these observations go is essentially what we wanted to understand. And you can see here that it was relatively common for leakage and warning signs, warning behaviors, to be reported to law enforcement. And what's interesting is that in more than 1 out of every 4 cases, warning signs were indeed reported to police. But of course, these shootings still happened. So this, in a way, highlights the need to include law enforcement partners in, understanding this path to intended violence, and also include the partners that they rely on, like courts, to understand the co-occurrence of warning signs and grievances and how they can come together to form warning signs for violence. And we often talk about, in the context of schools, for example, that there's reluctance to report concerning behaviors or Timmy made a threatening statement about bringing a gun to school, but I don't want to get Timmy in trouble. This is probably just me being overcautious, overreacting. And that's very difficult to combat among students. And it can be hard as well for law enforcement members who are part of the community, who may be part of the schools, to also overcome that worry about overreacting or not wanting to mess up a kid's life over something that may just be venting. So that's what. Oh my gosh.
You're good. And one other point to note, they took away our slides. One other point to note while they're fixing that is that in the other category of the reported sources, it was actually that people were reporting to the perpetrator's parents. And one of the things that we see time and time again is it's very difficult to get parents to then subsequently report on their children, right? And so that'll come into play a little bit later in our case study, but it ends up being a challenge in the sense that, we obviously want to get people to report, but then how do you get someone to effectively, what they're viewing as like narking or tattling on their loved one? So that also presents a bit of a challenge. Mm-hmm. There you go. I stretched for you. We're just not back up in here.
Yay. Okay.
Thank you. Do we need to leave it here? Okay. I'm gonna leave it there.
We're getting close to the end. All right, so I'm gonna slowly start to wrap up my section. We looked at concerning behaviors just sort of as a final factor in this pathway to violence. So additional concerning behaviors that perpetrators might have been exhibiting at the same time as these other observable pathway behaviors. We saw things like displaying anger and aggression, general hostility, expressing desire to kill or suicidal ideation. Social isolation was very common. Depressive behaviors and symptoms very common among our perpetrators. And I've said this a few times, but what's important about these behaviors is that they manifest outwardly. So they are indeed observable. And most of the data that we code in our database comes from people who reported on observing these behaviors and noticing that this person seemed very depressed. And another person said, well, they also talked about how they wanted to kill everybody. So there's sort of a variance of information that's kind of floating out there, but in many of these cases, it's not coming together in a really holistic way that lends to intervention. And on average, perpetrators exhibited more than 6 concerning behaviors prior to the attack. The number of concerning behaviors ranged from 1 to 18. We only had 7 people in our sample who didn't have any concerning behaviors that we were able to record. But this should be interpreted with caution because we are relying on sort of secondary data. So it might just be that nobody observed these behaviors, but they were still exhibiting depressive symptoms or social isolation. So bringing this kind of all back together, perpetrators of these shootings that we looked at are often simultaneously experiencing multiple strains. They're researching and planning their attacks. They're acquiring weapons and ammunition. They're making direct verbal threats or statements. And they're displaying these concerning behaviors all at the same time. And if left to continue on this pathway, the attack is all but guaranteed. But the recognizing these patterns and ensuring that law enforcement partners, as well as partners in the community and just the general lay public, understand how to observe and how to interpret these warning signs, and especially how to respond to them. This really provides critical opportunities to interrupt this pathway and prevent the violence from happening. And I'm now going to turn it back to Jackie.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to kind of add on to that final point, any one of these things that Emily covered would be concerning on its own right, but when you're starting to see them happen in tandem, in sort of like these large swaths of all of these things going on at once, even if this person wasn't per se going out to commit mass public violence, this still might be a person who is suicidal or in some other type of crisis that still needs help. So a lot of our findings, while they are in the context of mass public shootings, really are applicable more broadly to just things like, hey, if I saw this, I would be concerned. So as we mentioned at the beginning, we want to take you through a case study of how this kind of all manifests itself together all at one time. And bear with me. First of all, I'm sorry, I'm pacing. We were in a car for like 2.5 hours to get here, so I just can't stand still. But also, we try to inject a little bit of humor into this because obviously this is a lot to deal with after breakfast and before lunch. So I promise they're not offensive jokes, but it's okay to laugh. I will not be offended. I also do want to just kind of give a trigger warning, if you will. Unfortunately, this case study does involve, I will not be saying it, but some choice language and some vivid imagery. No pictures of decedents, but just in case, again, I will not be offended if you turn away or curse me under your breath, just as long as I can't hear it. So I want to take you guys back to Wednesday, May 14th of 2025. It was hump day. Come on, guys. God, tough crowd. And it was a typical night for all of us. I should mention that Emily, Hunter, and I have a group text. It literally says SISMs. And in Hunter's honor, the icon for our group text is a snowflake because he's afraid of the snow. And so I was doing what I was doing at that time of the year, which is watching my favorite hockey team on their way to their second Stanley Cup. Don't start just because you're having a good year. That's congratulations. You've had one good year in how many seasons? This is where we don't play. By the way, hey, Marty, thank you for Sam Reinhart. So I was watching the Panthers. Emily was on her way to Dreamyland because she was going to be moving the next day, and Hunter was doom scrolling on Daddit, which if you're not familiar with Daddit, is a subreddit. I don't go on Reddit, obviously. A subreddit on Reddit where you talk about all of your issues with being a dad. So like, my kid peed on themselves again. Timmy's slacking off in school. Molly won't stop cursing me out under her breath. Whatever they do on Daddit. I don't know. I'm not a dad. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Okay, apparently I got that right. And so while Hunter is scrolling, he sees a concerning post and immediately texts Emily and I, because we all text each other everything. We're like, oh, another shooting happened. Oh, this happened. Oh, this. And so this is the actual post. And now that I'm up here, I can actually see how small it is. So I'm going to just kind of kneel down and read it to you. It says, so I'm not really a dad, but I'm more of a father figure type to my 13-year-old brother due to our dad leaving when he was still in preschool. Today, while I was cleaning, I found this under his bed. What the hell is this, and what the F is he trying to do with it? It doesn't look like a real gun, but the writing and other things on it are highly disturbing to me. He is usually a creative and kind and caring young boy. That should have been the first kid. No teenager talks like that. It's honestly shocking to find something like this. Please, someone help me on what I should do about this. I'm not sure what or why he would have even thought about making something like this. Now, here's the context of this. We're knee-deep in this project. And for those of you who do not know me, I also grew up in the Parkland community, which is literally one of America's most preventable mass shooting tragedies in history. And I also went to college in Orlando where Pulse happened. So like my hypersensitivity to this kind of stuff is like next level. But I want to point out some of the things that we know, and Emily kind of talked about through those various grievances and motivations that really stood out to us when we saw this image. The first thing is the Nazi symbolism. And, I will say, you guys, we're in Buffalo. I'm not going to mince words here. The writing on this gun looks very similar to the writing of the gun that was on the gun at the top shooting, which mirrored the writing that was on the gun at the Christchurch, New Zealand shooting. So we see the swastikas. We see R.I.P. Eric, which three of us immediately went, that's Eric Harris from Columbine. We're like, okay, we get what's going on here. There is no God. I hate Muslims. He also talked about other racialized minorities on the firearm. We're going to leave those off. But if you look down here, you had 104 people upvote this, and then you had 73 people, and this was 58 minutes after the post had been made, 73 people who decided to engage with the poster. And when you actually read this, these were like people who really were trying to Monday night quarterback about stuff they know nothing about. They're like, oh, that sounds bad. You should tell someone. He did. He told you. Just like, oh, maybe that means Eric Harris. Like one person actually did get that. I give him credit. But there was not like, you should tell your mom. We already know mom's not going to rat on the kids. So all of it, so we're just sitting here watching this unfold going, oh God. What did we just walk into? And so immediately the three of us reach out to this person individually. I even made a Reddit account so I could reach out to him. And he ended up only wanting to talk to Hunter, which was fine. I mean, sometimes we only like to talk to Hunter and we don't want to talk to each other either. It happens. I'm just kidding. We actually like each other better than we like Hunter. Don't tell him though. And so while Hunter is talking with him, I go all CSI and start preserving evidence because one of the things I know is when you post things like a picture of a gun with racialized writing on it, it's going to get busted by terms of services and it's going to get pulled down. So I immediately start screenshotting everything that we can find, comments, pictures, all of that. Emily was moral support at this point. She was also trying to go to sleep.
I was awake.
And so while this is going on and Hunter is talking with this person, who we find out is a 16-year-old, the person makes another post and doesn't have actually any writing. It's just, oh, I found this. And so we see here on the image that there was, again, a lot of the carryover from the first image. So we've got the Nazi symbols again. We've got, there is no effing God, R word. This was what was more concerning to us, which is that this is a very crude drawing for an improvised explosive device or a bomb that if you put it all together in the right way and you lit it, you could blow up a lot of people. We're like, oh, this person is definitely planning, like this is a problem. So Hunter at the time is trying to encourage this kid, like, look, you need to go to the police. That's fine if you want to tell your mom, but this is like way bigger than you and your mom. You guys do not have the skills or the tools necessary to deal with a threat of this magnitude. Whether or not the gun was fake, I don't personally believe that it was. We're not going to sit here and play what if, right? Like, what if my dog had wings? Well, she would not be a bird. She'd be a dog with wings. We're not going to sit here and try and figure that out. We're going to take this threat credibly because you've put it out there and we have no choice but to believe what you have done. I mentioned that I grew up in the Parkland community, and if you are not familiar with that case, there were actually people prior to that shooting who reported into the FBI and their tip line. We actually have a copy of the tip, and said, hey, this is going to happen. And the FBI did not send the tip to the field office for investigation, and subsequently it sat on someone's desk, and we know how that ended, and it cost the FBI a lot of money. So for me, then having to trust this system that I've already seen fail my community was incredibly difficult, but I put my big girl pants on and with my hockey jersey. And I said, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and submit this in and trust that the process is going to work. And I will say, if you have not already used the FBI tip line, it is very easy and smooth to use. There is only one drawback to it, in my opinion, and I understand why they did it this way, because bots and spam, but you cannot upload any attachments to it. So now I've got all of this evidence that I so meticulously collated, and or cultivated, curated, whatever, one of those C words, and I can't give it to them at that moment. So I'm like, okay, so like as I'm like filling out this form, I'm like, but I have all of this stuff, just somebody contact me so I can give it to you. And then I hit submit, and then I watched the Panthers win the game, and I went to bed. I'm just gonna keep, he gave me stuff, so I'm gonna just keep giving it back. Listen, everybody's broken, you can't talk about that. So the next day, we were back to working on the project, and we're like, we don't know what's going on, and my phone rings. And it is a special agent from the FBI in the Syracuse field office. And I'm like, oh, thank goodness, somebody's taking this seriously. And so I get on the phone with him, and the reason that they called from Syracuse is because that's where I live, and I was the one who had made the tip. If Emily had called, then the Boston field office would have called Emily, or the Austin field office would have called Hunter, I guess San Antonio for him. And so the special agent calls, and I kind of walk him through everything, and then I send him what I have, and I'm like, and this is why we're very concerned about this, and this correlates, and he's just like fascinated. He's like, how do you know all of this? And I was like, well, sir, it's very rare that the 3 mass shooting experts actually find the mass shooting threat, but it's your lucky day, so here you go, I've made your job easier. And so he says, great. He goes, I really appreciate you turning all of this over. We're gonna go through and we're gonna investigate it. And I said, okay, great. And he's like, we'll follow up. And I'm like, is this like Delta when you've lost your luggage, like you're never gonna hear from them again? So I just had to, again, trust a system I've already seen let my community down. And so several months go by, and it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. Fortunately, we didn't hear about any shootings perpetrated by 13-year-olds with guns under their bed. And so we're like, okay, maybe we're in the clear. We don't really know. And then when you least expect it, we get another phone call, and it's the special agent. And he says, and keep in mind, we're dealing with, allegedly, at this point, 2 juveniles, a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old. And, so they have protection because they're juveniles, but also this is now an investigation, and I'm just a tipster, so my right to know anything is very, very limited to non-existent. And he calls us back, and he says, look, I said I was gonna call you back, and I'm like, faith restored. And he said, we were able to make contact with the family. They're out in Pennsylvania. And we did talk to the mother and the kid, and we've been able to connect them with services to make sure that they're getting the help that they need. And I was like, great. I was like, listen, I know you can't tell us a whole lot because of all of these different things we have to be mindful of, but I just have one question for you because, again, I'm very hyper aware of my own personal sensitivities because of my background. And so I said, was this a credible threat, or were we like hypochondriacs, just freaking out for absolutely no reason? And this agent says to me, had you not called, there would have been another shooting. And I said, great, have a lovely day. Thanks for letting me know. Because at this point, I've been working in this space for 17 years, and all I ever wanted to do, and more so after Parkland, was just prevent anyone from losing their life. So I'm like, mission accomplished. We all felt great about ourselves. We like high-fived over text message, and then we're like, all right, let's get back to work so we can do this more. Interestingly enough, the original poster reaches back out to Hunter. Hunter is very personable. We're just picking on him because he's not here. And so he reaches back out to Hunter and says, hey, I just made another post on Reddit. I think you should take a look. We're like, oh God, here we go again. This is the post. Hello to anyone who is still watching my page closely due to recent events. For whoever saw that post, I was in a very bad mental state at the time. There was no older or younger brother, it was all me. I needed help. I didn't know how to properly reach it though. I am now getting help and doing a lot better. While I won't exactly say thanks to whoever reported the post, I will say that somehow through this whole mess of FBI chaos, I did get the help at the end, so half thanks. Smiley face. I was like, that's all we're getting from a teenager, it's cool. This shows that the power of bystanders is so much more than we know it to be. And while 100 people were sitting there armchair psychologizing this kid, we took action, and because of that, people we don't even know are still on this planet today to tell their story because somebody did something and then somebody said something, we said something, and someone else did something. That's the way this process is supposed to work. But the problem is that we have those other 100 people who aren't coming forward, who aren't saying anything. So some key takeaways, we'll wrap up and we'll open it up for questions. We may even get you guys out of here early because we know that we're competing with lunch. So first, we really want to underscore that prevention is possible. Listen, we're researchers at the end of the day. We're data nerds. If we can help stop a mass shooting, every single person in this room can help stop a mass shooting. We don't have to live like we're living in this country when something is so overtly preventable. It's important to know the signs, not to write them off, but to really understand how they're all coming together in this perfect storm. It's never just one thing. I'm sure your parents also said this to you. My mom always used to say, it's not the straw that broke the camel's back, it's the 10,000 pounds of stuff that went on before it. It's not one thing that's gonna set this person off on this pathway. It's all of these cumulative things coming together. And if we are able to recognize what we are seeing and put it together and get it to the hands of the people who can do something, then we can get these individuals the help that they need and get them off the pathway. So we have to make sure that people are reporting their concerns. We need people to understand why it's important and how to do it. And the big thing is, fortunately, we knew FBItips.gov. That was really helpful for us to know that. But if you don't tell people where to go, just randomly calling 911, if I called 911 that night instead of going to FBI tips, we would have been in a very different situation because it would have been bouncing all over cyberspace until it got to the right person. So making sure that we're educating people about how to report their concerns, what that process looks like, and then making sure that we're teaching them not to assume that everyone around them is doing that. Because here's the thing. If I looked at my friend Marty here and I'm like, Marty, he's gonna do it, I don't need to worry about it, and then Marty looks at me and says, well, Jackie's gonna do it, I don't need to worry about it, then neither of us have done it. But if we both do it, then we have redundancy in information, which is now going to increase the likelihood that it gets taken care of because now people are like, oh, 2 people have said this, not just one person has said this. In terms of our next steps, what we're now planning to do is take the show on the road, as they say, not necessarily running around presenting, but we want to translate everything that we have learned, both through the research and also through our experiences of Reddit. And we want to teach people how to prevent mass shootings, what to look for, what the perfect storm looks like, and what they should be doing. So our ultimate goals, as we originally pitched them to DHS, was to improve the identification of threats by at least 40% and improve the likelihood of reporting by at least 30%. And so we're planning to develop those trainings, which will be web-based with vignettes and attention checks, as well as a pre and a post test, so we can make those measurements actually starting next month. And from there, we are planning to pilot test the trainings with 15 K-12 schools. So we'll be working directly with high school students as well as district-wide faculty, staff, and administrators. We do have some spots open, so if there's any schools that want to participate, hit us up. And so in addition to them, we're also pilot testing at 3 colleges and universities, and as well as a pilot test with 5,000 members of the general public. So we'll be running this pilot with about 30,000 different people, just to make sure that, because we're going to have sort of different iterations very slightly based on the fact that like K-12 schools and colleges and universities have different resources available for reporting and things of that nature. Same for the general public, so we want to capture those differences. And then, assuming all goes well and we hit our targets, we will be releasing the full trainings and all accompanying training materials out at the beginning of next year. They will be free to use. So whether you want to use them in your school, your workplace, your place of worship, your mall, I don't care. But I think the most important thing is that we are teaching people that this is preventable and that everybody plays a role in that prevention. I will also just wrap up by saying we will have our initial report of findings, which you guys, again, just got the preview of, out in June, as well as the most likely initial release of our data. So it has 290 variables between the 2 data sets. It might be 293. But it's very, very comprehensive, comes in multiple forms. So if there's any other data nerds out there, welcome to our club. With that, we would like to thank you for your time. This is our project website and hopefully a working QR code. I did test it at like 11:54 last night, which will take you right to the project website. You can sign up for updates. Again, we will be doing intermittent releases over the rest of the year. And with that, we would like to open it up for questions.
Jackie and Emily, thank you. That was a fantastic presentation, and what an impressive compilation and distillation of information. I don't know how you get your arms around something like that, and congratulations on preventing a tragedy. I mean, that is wonderful.
Thank you.
So with that, do we have any questions in the House? Mr. Clark is on our Erie County Law Enforcement Board and always has good questions.
It was phenomenal, thank you. Sort of a 3-part question. So sensitivity is an issue. So we look at 20 years ago, these violent games, and now how many of your perpetrators are copycats? And one of the things that's counterintuitive to me is with the shooter that shot the CEO for healthcare, and the support he got for that behavior is beyond what I can understand. So could you comment on those 3 things, sort of how it's really sensitizing or desensitizing our society?
Before you answer that, I wanted to remind our virtual audience that if you have a question, please email it to albertic@buffalo.edu.
So great questions. I will say, I'll kind of go backwards. The United Healthcare shooter wouldn't have been in our data set because he wasn't a mass shooter. So that's more, it's targeted violence, but it's very different. Like there's a more directed grievance. So, you know, the reality is that there are people out there who still support mass shooters after they did what they did. For instance, our shooter in Parkland got like thousands and thousands of dollars. The same thing happened with the Aurora shooter that, you know, and I don't want to generalize, so I apologize to the folks in this room who are like me. It tends to be women who are sexually attracted to these individuals. It's a phenomenon called hyperstophilia. And so, you know, there are people, each of these shooters ends up with like their own fan group. Like the Aurora shooter, his name is James Holmes. They call themselves the Homies. It's wild. I don't personally understand it. My brain does not work that way, but, you know, I can't comment on why they get so much support. I think, you know, there may be people who see their own grievances in that person and maybe wouldn't take the same action, so they sort of applaud someone who did. We did not code for copycatting. We did code for fame seeking. And actually what our data showed is compared to other studies out there, it's very overestimated. You know, if you listen to the media, everybody wants to be a celebrity, and that's why they're all doing this. And I think The reality is, and I'm jumping in, there's only so much that we can control in this equation. I'm a huge supporter of no notoriety. I have been for years. And the reality is, when I started my career, I was hell-bent, pardon my language, on telling everyone in this room, the media are lying to you, the media are blowing this out of proportion. Yes, this is really bad, but it's not as bad as they're making it out to be. Like, you have a better chance of walking outside on a very clear day and getting struck by lightning than being a victim of a mass shooting. I'm not going to change the media, and I had to give that up very, very soon, or very early in my career. And so even being like a supporter of no notoriety, we don't ever, you can read anything that we've written in probably the past 10 years, we don't name perpetrators. We're not giving them what they want, because it's like dealing with children. You don't reward bad behavior, but we can't stop everybody else. So, if you stop the shooting from happening in the first place, you remove the element that you would be copycatting. So I think that that's more of a directed way to deal with it. And as far as video games, we did look at simulation for training. We didn't look specifically if they played video games. And there's a huge body of research that shows that that's been overestimated. One of my favorite quotes from back when the Aurora shooting happened, because Grand Theft Auto, like one of the 8,000 iterations of Grand Theft Auto, had come out like 3 weeks before, had record sales. The shooter had also played it, and so did 40,000 other people. And it's like, well, that's great that he did, but correlation is not causation. It's not even correlation at that point statistically. But it's very much sort of this moral panic over gun violence in video games than it is an actual correlate.
And I'll add to that, while copycatting and imitation and fame seeking, and copycatting and imitation are a part of fame seeking, they are, as Jackie said, very rare, but the behaviors that manifest before the shooting on the pathway to violence related to expressing admiration or idolizing these shooters, I think kind of falls under the umbrella of copycatting. Those are important warning signs that are absolutely part of the trainings we're going to be putting out. So, it is relatively common among shooters to have this admiration and to want to mimic and copycat others. Whether or not their actual attacks are perpetrated solely for that reason is a little hard to determine, because that gets into understanding what's happening in someone's brain. But it's definitely an important warning sign. I think that it's something that we want to raise more awareness about in terms of its utility for prevention.
Yeah, and two other things I'll add to that is it'll also manifest through the legacy tokens. So like one that stands out immediately to me is the Virginia Tech shooter, who basically was like, I die on the cross like Jesus, and this is for Eric and Dylan, and because we're all martyrs, and this, it was very clear who he was like idolizing in that sense. One other thing I meant to add when we talked about our next step is we've also collected not just the data that we've now quantitized. I just learned that word. I'm very excited about quantitizing data. But we also collected a lot of those legacy tokens. So we have manifestos, we have journals, we have suicide letters. And so part of that training that we're going to be developing is we're going back through all of those documents and doing a linguistic analysis to see if that, because they are studying each other, if they're messaging the same way, and if there's themes that we can then say to somebody, this is how it might look because this is how many people have done it. Thank you for those questions.
Have a question back here.
Where do you go?
Hi, my name's Marla. I'm a school counselor. Something stuck out to me. Amazing presentation. Thank you. Something stuck out to me that I was just wondering if you could elaborate on is the high percentage of the people who showed psychiatric issues, but then all purchased guns legally. I mean, obviously we're in New York State, so that was a little stood out to me. Was there any look at how that happened? Is there different states with different laws? Are the red flags not working? Are they not being used? Anything like that in the prevention scheme?
This is such a good question.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I will say, Emily can jump in on this because we also have a grant with NIJ, at least right now, knock on wood, that we're actually looking at mass shootings and ERPOs specifically, but putting aside ERPOs for 1 second, one of the main legal mechanisms why they were able to purchase lawfully is because in order to be disqualified because of a mental health issue, you have to be adjudicated by a court as defective. So like to the point of where you're not able to function as a normal human being. And so that usually requires involuntary commitment and then hearings and other things of that nature, which very few of them actually went through. The Virginia Tech shooter is one of the biggest examples. He did go through that. He was determined, we have all the paperwork, he was determined to be an imminent danger to himself and others, but because they marked him as outpatient, they never reported it to the background check system, which means that even though he was a prohibited purchaser, he wasn't flagged in the system. ERPOs are also a relatively newer process that can be used. Again, they weren't available really until 2014, and our data goes all the way back to 1999. I'll let you speak more on ERPOs.
Yeah, so ERPOs are great in principle, but there's a lot of issues right now with how they're used. And there's a lot of research being done to try to explore how they can be maximized in terms of their function and violence prevention. But every state has different standards for how an ERPO can be used. So different behavioral standards of what kinds of behaviors qualify for somebody to actually petition. There's different petitioners in every state. So in some states, only law enforcement can petition for an ERPO. In other states, a school guidance counselor could petition for an ERPO. But there's a lot of variability. There's not a lot of outreach to the community about, just education about how ERPOs or red flag laws can be used. They have different names across different states, right? So there's just a general lack of standardization, lack of information about them. They have been used to prevent various forms of gun violence, I think most commonly suicide, but also mass violence and domestic violence as well. But there's, I think, still pretty significant hurdles in terms of them actually being used both by petitioners and general civilians or even law enforcement, and even within the court systems. One thing that I've learned while we've been running this NIJ project is that the people who are responsible for processing ERPO sometimes have never done it before. I had a student in the PhD program at UMass Lowell who was a police lieutenant, and he came to me about a concerning student that he had come across in his community. And there were some pretty significant warning signs. This kid was kind of checking off a lot of the boxes that we talked about. So the student was asking me, what would you recommend? And I said, well, don't we have ERPOs in Massachusetts? I think we do. And he was like, oh my God, you're right. So I think there's just still this disconnect between ERPOs and red flag laws being identified as something that is usable, something that we can, promote both among law enforcement and community members.
Thank you. Do you want to take a question from a Sabre fan?
Not really, but I will.
He's Marty Floss. He's on the Erie County Law Enforcement Foundation Board.
Marty and I go back to 2014.
Okay, professor at Hilbert College. Marty?
Hi, as a member of the executive board here, we're thrilled at the quality of this presentation, so thank you so much. You know I'm a researcher as well. You gave a really good diagram that showed risks, and especially if they were a combination of risks. I'm just curious if you've been able to quantify false negatives is what I'm thinking. So those percentages were within your study sample. I'm wondering what might be those percentages of people not in your study that have those same combinations, and it piggybacks on Kevin's question about violent videos. And I'll say that I think what we need to do is always be on the side of caution, right, of that. So anyways, do you have any idea about the general population?
I'm going to tag into Emily.
That's a great question. I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but that is absolutely the most important next step, I think, for the behavioral threat assessment area of research, community practice, is to get comparison groups, because there's a severe lack of comparison in especially criminological academic research, and especially in this field. Like in our project, we just looked at mass shooters. We didn't look at all the people who have the same background characteristics, who have the same demographic characteristics, who are living the same lives as these individuals who commit mass shootings but don't go and do that. And that's the important part that we have to understand, is the difference between those. But generally, it's hard to get information on the people who don't come to the attention of law enforcement or even their communities. So unfortunately, I don't have those answers, but it's definitely a direction that the field is moving towards. I'm part of another project looking at school shootings in the U.S., and we did try to get a comparison sample of students who went to the same schools that were victimized by school shootings but didn't carry out an attack. And it was really difficult to get any information on, even very recent cases or, recent years.
One thing I'll actually add to that is, as I mentioned, we purposefully pulled out of about 400 cases, these 171, because we knew for a fact that they had exhibited warning signs and behaviors. So we also still have these other 202 cases that we're currently working through now. It's actually probably more now because of 2025, that we're still working through, which could potentially level out some of these numbers, or it could potentially, it's still people that committed mass shootings, but if they didn't exhibit these same warning signs, then that gives us basically two comparative groups of completed attacks where we can sort of tease out some of those differences. Thank you for that research-based question, Marty.
Okay.
Go
Here,
Panthers.
I have a question over here.
Where are we looking?
Hi.
Okay.
My name is Brandon Fox. Thanks. Today's presentation was very helpful. My question is around the slide that you had where you pulled out the 5 different grievances and the percentages in between. When assessing the risk of an individual, do you have enough data to say that a correlation of those grievances increases the risk of that individual?
So, we want this data to be interpreted cautiously. We probably wouldn't recommend that this be used to calculate risk. There's assessments and protocols that can be done for that. At this point, this is descriptive. It's more to inform decisions, but not necessarily give a concrete kind of standardized assessment of, well, if you see this person who has all 4 of these grievances or stressors, then they have this much higher percentage chance of committing a shooting. And this kind of gets back to Marty's question, that if we had that comparison, if we had folks who had those 4 grievances and stressors and didn't commit a mass shooting, then we would be able to calculate, relative risk and give kind of a better assessment of, how concerned you should be if you see these kinds of behaviors. Unfortunately, the way the field is right now, what we encourage people to do is just err on the side of caution. Best case, I don't know if I can say best or worst case scenario, but on one hand, if you're right about a person, then you could be preventing a violent incident. If you're wrong, this person is still exhibiting concerning behaviors. They're still dealing with a lot, so it's likely that they do need some help, even if they weren't planning violence. So kind of either way, hopefully, you're benefiting somebody by intervening in their life, but ideally, in the future, I don't know how long this will take, we will be able to provide a more concrete estimation of how this affects risk.
And we also haven't looked at, I think there was 18 different grievances. We didn't look at all 18 in terms of how they're all interacting with each other. We just said, okay, these are the top 5. Let's look at how those are. And that also gives us, things to continue to work for. As you might imagine, with a database that we could probably toilet paper the stage with at this point, we have a lot we can play with. So we're really in our very early stages of being able to do things I think that researchers in this space haven't been able to do before. So, we'll definitely put that on the list for higher up, and then maybe next year we'll see you again and we can answer that better.
Okay, have another question back here.
Hi, my name's Amanda Grenier, and I'm a counselor at the Stanley G. Falk School. which is a special day school for children with emotional and behavioral disabilities. Does disability status or age matter in reporting this? Last year there was an incident that I had reported to our superintendent, and I got a lot of pushback that, oh, our kids just make those kinds of threats, and it was just kind of brushed off.
You know,
I also work with 3 through 6th grade, if that matters.
so we haven't necessarily looked at disability status. The challenge, especially for juvenile shooters, is a lot of information is protected and subsequently gets redacted. We actually have one case in our database. We still don't even know the perpetrator's name because they were 12 years old when they committed the shooting, and that information is protected of them being at juvenile status. You know, but I think what your question speaks to is a much broader issue, which is that we have normalized the language of gun violence as a society where we've made it acceptable to talk like that without repercussions. That's not to suggest that we go back to the post-Columbine, immediate post-Columbine era of you ate your chicken nugget in the shape of a gun and you're 5 years old, you're suspended for the rest of the year. I don't think we need to go that extreme, but I think we do need to go back to saying, like, you can't say these things without consequences. This is not an okay thing to say. Like, you don't, I remember when I was growing up, you know, when I was a horrific teenager, I will admit that I was, you know, and you tell your parents, like, drop dead. You're not supposed to say that, but you do because you're an angry teenager. And, you know, my mom saying, well, my cousin said that to her dad and he did, so I wouldn't do that if I were you. I understood actions and language has consequences, but if you're continuing to allow people to say things like that and then going, well, kids are kids and they're just gonna say that, it makes it much harder to tease out who's real and who's serious, which then gets back to the age-old problem of the boy who cries wolf. And then it's like, well, we're gonna just not take anybody, you either take everybody seriously at that point or you take nobody seriously. And as Emily said, again, I recognize my own sensitivity based on where I came from. I don't think we're at a stage in this country when mass shootings are becoming more frequent, not less, that we can just be like, all right, we're doing it for nobody. Like, I know not to say those things, and you know, I think other people need to be taught, like, you don't need to be expelled for an entire year, and I don't know that we necessarily need to raise it to the level of a criminal felony for making a terroristic threat, but there has to be a balance between we do nothing and you're now a convicted felon. What that is, I don't know, but I applaud you or whoever for bringing it forward because we shouldn't normalize that language.
And, you know, age and developmental disability are difficult, you know, in terms of getting people to listen for the exact reasons that you said. We know that kids as young as 3rd grade, younger than that, have committed shootings at their schools. So it's not, you know, something that could never happen. But unfortunately, I'm not surprised that, you know, you got pushed back because this is reminiscent of the Parkland shooter who a kid reported his behavior to the principal, and the principal told that reporter to look up the definition of autism. And nothing, you know, happened. He didn't do anything because it was assumed he's just exhibiting these behaviors because of his developmental profile.
Okay, we have one more question from Kevin Clark.
So your comparisons, you're looking at a comparison group, as Marty said, you have all these people over here that exhibit these issues and don't do anything. Can you explain to me why 94% of the shooters are male, right? And are women just that more empathetic, or they just don't have the opportunity? I would, if you'd give me a little color on that, that would be great, and the rest of the audience.
Maybe we're just better at not getting caught. I'm just kidding. So in reality, if you just look at crime data more broadly, women rarely pick up guns. It's not what we do. I mean, I don't do crime, just so that we're clear. But women are much less likely than men to pick up firearms. If you ever watched an episode of Snapped, you'll know that they like to do things like put antifreeze in your orange juice, smother you with a pillow, pay someone else to do it. So it just kind of mirrors those same broader patterns of gender-based offending. Women just don't pick up guns. What's also interesting is that we've in the 5-ish% of mass shooters that are women, they usually don't co-offend. There have been some cases where there's been co-offender, like a man and a woman together, but they usually are not co-offending. And we have seen that some of those individuals do tend to pick up more masculine traits. Not saying that they're a transgender. I'm not opening that can of worms, because the media has done that over and over and criminalized a completely nonviolent population. But they may take up, kind of more of that male persona in the way that they have approached the shooting. And so, I think it really just mirrors those broader crime trends of, if you look at just general homicide data and gun violence data, it's usually men like guns. Women would rather just give you antifreeze in your orange juice, because you can't see it.
Yeah, there's all sorts of research out there about masculinity and cultures of honor and how that impacts things like mass shootings. So it's definitely a known phenomenon in the literature that most mass shooters are indeed men. But I think Jaclyn, explains it perfectly, that it mirrors what we see in gun violence more broadly.
Well, on behalf of Buffalo, New York, and Sabre fans everywhere, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
We'll see you next year.
And if we could put up the slide for the evaluation, folks, we'd love to know how you felt about today's programs and what you might want us to consider moving forward for topics. Thank you very much for coming. I hope it's warmed up outside, and spring is close, and the Sabres are going to the playoffs.
The Sabres, my team's out. I don't even care anymore.
I'm definitely not rooting for Edmonton.
Do you want to get some pictures? You want to get some pictures up there?
Very powerful.
Yeah, it was great.
Extraordinarily powerful. I mean, I think that's a home run for us being able to go to beyond.
Yes.
So, just great job.
Thank you.
I think
Thank
the
you.
combination of both of those